Welcome back, everybody. This is season 2, episode 2 of From Guns to Keyboards. We are recording this episode after several major events that have happened just over the past week since our last episode. We are recording just after the election of Trump to the presidency, which will definitely have major consequences for Israel and the region. We are recording after receiving the terrible news of what happened in Amsterdam, where many are describing the attacks on Israeli soccer fans as being something of a modern pogrom taking place in the streets of Amsterdam. And, of course, in addition to those two news points, we have the third and perhaps most impactful news point, which is the firing of Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense in Israel. All this comes alongside the sad yet undeniable fact that we are in day 400 of the war, if you can believe it.
Yeah. By Israeli standards, actually no, not the longest war, because the Independence War would have been by far the longest, but the longest in modern history.
The longest in modern history. 400.
Yeah. I guess let's dive right into it. Probably the biggest news, I think the thing that most people are talking about, U.S. election.
U.S. election.
So are we ready to make America great again, round 2?
Looks like we won't have a choice in the matter.
No, we won't. It's I guess, full disclosure, I didn't vote from California, so California always goes Democratic. For those who don't understand the electoral college system or who aren't aware of it, it's generally per state. Not generally, it is per state. Each state has 2 votes, and each state will vote for who they want to be president. And for California, it is it's a wide margin in favor of the Democrats. So for me, being abroad, I didn't feel like going through the whole rigmarole of voting for what would inevitably have been 2 votes for Kamala Harris.
Right. Yeah, I honestly can identify with you. My vote would be for in the state of New York, and I also did not vote this time around. I guess we're 2 terrible expat Americans.
I guess so. Well, we've been here for almost a decade now, so we're more Israeli than American. But yeah, had I grown up in maybe Michigan or Florida or Pennsylvania, I would have voted.
You would have got the vote out there.
Yeah, I think that's how a lot of Americans feel as well at the Electoral College.
There are some who say that Trump's election to the presidency is going to be great for Israel as a very pro-Israel candidate and former president coming back to power. And there are some who say that Trump's re-election is actually a sign of uncertainty for Israel.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, I mean, if you poll your average Israeli, and I believe the number was about 64% of Israelis preferred Trump. I think it's actually the only U.S. ally that was largely in favor of Trump. I always caution Israelis who are eagerly pro-Trump, who seem to think that Donald Trump is by far the better choice, that at the end of the day, this guy's a wild card.
Yeah.
There's really no guarantee of what he's going to do or think in regards to Israel. Whereas Kamala Harris, I felt like, was a far more predictable choice. I always look at Kamala as, she's kind of a very successful cog within the Democratic establishment. She isn't someone who strikes me as particularly idealistic. She doesn't really bring much of an agenda to the table. She likes to talk. When she was Attorney General of California, she spoke of herself as being a progressive prosecutor. Someone who wanted to focus on reform rather than punishment. But at the end of the day, when you look at her history of policies, she's someone who, advocated for the death penalty and pursued maximum sentencing for low-level drug offenders.
Right.
This is not someone who falls in the progressive camp, regardless of all her rhetoric.
She was an establishment candidate.
Very much an establishment candidate. That's exactly how I would look at it. And so I always said, look, if you like Joe Biden, you're going to get the same with Kamala Harris. Funnily enough, despite Joe Biden being historically the most pro-Israel president ever in the history of Israeli-American relationship, Israelis were, I think by now, Israelis are very disillusioned and disenchanted with Joe Biden.
With Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think now that he has become a lame duck president, we are going to see, in my opinion at least, this is my prediction, a huge uptick in activity on all sides in terms of military activity coming from Israel, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza. I think that on all fronts, everybody's going to look at this lame duck president and look at the new guy who's coming into the White House just 3 months from now and say, if we, or even less than 3 months, 2 months from now,
Mm-hmm.
and say, this is our time to do what we want to do before that mad dog goes into the White House.
Yeah, to kind of jockey for position and preparation of a new president who his policy is quite unclear. I mean, one thing Trump said, he said a couple times, this war better be over by the time I take office. What will happen if it's not over is very vague, but it's clear this is not an issue that Donald Trump seems particularly interested in dealing with and
Right.
handling. Like most Americans, I'm sure he identifies more strongly with the Israelis than he does with Hamas and the Palestinians. However, he's somebody who left office cursing Bibi, and someone who, as the representative of the America First agenda, is not interested in funding foreign wars.
Right.
He's not even interested in funding his allies like NATO. The idea, I think, that he's going to be willing to spend billions of dollars and send U.S. troops to put their lives in danger for Israel, for a war that Donald Trump himself on Truth Social a year ago was writing and saying that Israelis need to pursue a ceasefire and Israelis are in the wrong for this war. The idea that he's going to continue funding that war as openly as Joe Biden did, I just find hard to believe.
Yeah. I take what you say and I analyze it with respect to Israel's military activity in Lebanon. And I can't help but think that we're at something of a crossing point now in Lebanon where Israel is going to have to either just end the war and the quote unquote limited ground incursion. For those who, you obviously can't see what I'm doing right now, but I'm making fake quotes up in the air.
The Dr. Evil finger quotes.
Yeah, exactly. The Dr. Evil finger quotes of limited ground incursion that we'll see how this mission creep ultimately changes going forward. But Israel has a choice to make where it's either going to put an end to this limited ground incursion and say we've achieved what we want to achieve. And Israel does have very respectable achievements in South Lebanon of basically taking out the threat of anti-tank missiles immediately on the border and taking out the threat of special forces from Hezbollah invading Israeli towns. Either Israel's going to take the win, or it's going to say, if we want at any point to take over the rest of South Lebanon and invade the rest of South Lebanese territory, if we don't act now, we're going to be facing a very strong president who's going to come to power in January, who's not going to want this war to continue. And
who represents the will of the American people who also don't want this war to continue.
Right. And you add that onto the operational concern that I highly doubt that Israel is going to expand a ground invasion of Lebanon in the middle of winter, in the middle of January in Lebanon. So there's operational concerns here at play where Israel is just before the beginning of the deeper winter in Lebanon, that from an operational perspective will make an expansion of maneuver much more challenging. It's currently with a lame duck president. So, like I said, it can choose to go down the route of take the win, stop, or it can go down the other route of say, let's take advantage of this lame duck and go ahead and expand.
And push because look, I will say from the argument to the other side is that, we're now up to about, I believe, 200 rockets a day from Hezbollah into still primarily northern Israel, less so in the center coming from Hezbollah, but the point still stands that Hezbollah is slowly, albeit successfully, reorganizing and is able to access a lot of their capabilities post the Nasrallah killing, which left them incredibly disorganized and very much on the back foot. They've since apparently been able to come together. And 200 rockets a day, we're talking about an arsenal of between, some estimates, between 100,000 and 250,000 rockets. So 200 a day leaves them, I would say, with a year's worth of supplies to continue launching hundreds of rockets into northern Israel, and to turn this war into what many on the Israeli side feared would happen in against a front in Lebanon, which is hundreds of rockets a day targeting essential Israeli infrastructure and military bases within greater Israel.
Yeah, and the effects of this on business are going to be very long term.
Mm-hmm.
Businesses are willing, especially when it comes to international commerce and trade, whether it's the airlines that are canceling their flights to Israel or other international businesses.
Yeah, no longer postponing, but actually canceling indefinitely.
Right. These things can, or these companies or international corporations can be more forgiving at first when they believe that there's short-term disruptions to their supply chains or activity. But when they believe that Israel is no longer a reliable country to have operations in because it's being shot at from Lebanon, from Gaza, and from other areas, it's going to rethink things in the long term. Today I mentioned this to you earlier. Today I was at the beach, and in Tel Aviv we got a notification to our phones and also sirens going off in Tel Aviv that a drone was traveling around the city and had not yet been intercepted. And we ended up discovering 20 minutes after all of us ran to the bomb shelters and tried to go to safety that this was a false alarm triggered in the city of Tel Aviv, and there was nothing really to worry about. And when I came over here earlier to record this podcast episode, we're here in Dillon's apartment. We both had this experience of thinking that a drone from Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or wherever was traveling around Israeli skies and looking to cause whatever sort of damage it was looking to cause. And neither of us even spoke about this. We kind of just accepted it as being this new normal of drones coming into Israeli airspace. Of course, this ended up being a false alarm, but it just goes to show that we in Israel have very much normalized these events as being day to day. International businesses will not normalize that.
Yeah.
And that gap between us taking these things as being very day to day and being like, all right, whatever, false alarm, no biggie.
Back to business.
And what the C-suite of Delta Airlines is going to say when they look at something like this is two very, very, very different things.
Yeah, I think already too. I mean, we've seen a lot of negative effects on the Israeli economy and on foreign investment as well. And I think that, as you mentioned, it's just going to continue to get worse. To bring it back to the military, potentially in response to, or especially in response to a Donald Trump presidency, like I say, I very much caution Israelis who come with this very overly optimistic attitude about Donald Trump to come into it with a certain amount of caution, to temper that excitement a little bit, because one of Donald Trump's strengths at the foreign policy level is that he is kind of a mad dog. You really have no idea what he's going to do.
Yeah.
It's what makes him such a formidable adversary, but on the flip side, it makes him an unreliable ally as well, as the European countries will gladly tell you. I mean, all of Europe was praying for a Kamala Harris victory for that exact reason, because with Kamala, she's very predictable. We know what to expect with her. Donald Trump, not so much. It's unclear, other than the fact that his attitude is very anti-foreign investment and very America first. And anyone in the America first camp is going to look at Gaza and America's support of Gaza, and of the Israeli assault in Gaza and Lebanon, and say, why are we funding this? This is billions of dollars of American treasure. These are American soldiers. I think we're up to about 7 now who have died in the course of this war on behalf of Israel, 7 Americans. And say, why? Why are we doing this for a country that refuses to listen to us and that, kind of plays by its own rules and doesn't seem to share our values and is committing these atrocities unabashedly? It's a fair question from an American perspective. So that being said, since we're onto this one, what's your prediction for a Donald Trump presidency?
I think that we're gonna see. I'll break down my answer between the next 2 months as Trump slowly comes into power and transitions his administration, and when Trump ultimately takes the reins. I think the next 2 months is going to are going to include many a significant increase in military activity on all sides. I think that the Israelis are going to take advantage of this to carry out the strikes on Iran that they know that Donald Trump will not tolerate when he's in power, um, be it strikes on sensitive oil and nuclear facilities that under Trump administration will be unacceptable, or military activity in the greater region. We mentioned Lebanon earlier, an expansion of military activity also beyond those two theaters of operation. This is Israel's time. If Israel wants to do anything, it has to act now. Any consequences, Trump can just blame on Biden and say, oh, the Israelis went ahead and attacked Iranian oil facilities. If old Joe just let me come to power already, then this wouldn't have happened if I was in the
Right.
White House. So this is the Israeli side. It's the same thing with the Iranians. The Iranians, I think, are in the same boat as the Israelis, where they know that if they want to respond to the Israelis, that this is their time to respond for the last strike on their ballistic missile sites and their radar systems and their air defense systems. I think everybody's kind of on the same page when it comes to the next couple months. In terms of when Donald Trump comes to power, I think that Trump is looking to create some sort of picture of victory from his perspective. And I think victory from his perspective is the ability to show that he was able to bring about some sort of great deal in the Middle East. I don't know if he's necessarily going to pressure Israel into ending the war on day one. I think that Donald Trump is, at his core, at least with his base, still a pro-Israel president and still wants to give an answer to much of his base, which does support the state of Israel, not including the many Muslim voters that surprisingly voted for Donald Trump on election day, but we'll put that aside for now. Much of his base is very pro-Israel and very supportive of these policies. I think he's going to need some win from Bibi, whether it's normalization with Saudi Arabia, whether it's cutting some sort of deal in Lebanon, cutting some sort of deal in Gaza. My prediction is that if Donald Trump can get at least one picture of victory, one great deal in the Middle East, he'll let everything else slide when it comes to Israel. But if the same sort of tension that we saw between Biden and Bibi manifests itself between Trump and Bibi in the initial months of Trump's administration, I think that we might see a repeat of the recordings that were later leaked in which Trump referred to Bibi as, to the best of my knowledge, a fucking asshole.
Yeah, he's son of a bitch.
Son of a bitch.
Something
yeah.
along those lines. Yeah.
Something very Trumpian.
Yeah, something very crass and directed and Trumpian, exactly as you said. Yeah, I can picture a couple scenarios. I mean, I can very much see, and I think you actually said this too several weeks back, where you said, it's not hard to predict Donald Trump coming into office and saying to the Israelis, okay, look, you guys have a couple months, take the gloves off, do what you got to do, but after that, that's it. No more weapons, no more money, no more political cover. You guys are on your own. You can't bring this to a conclusive end within the first 100 days, then you're doing it. You're going at it alone. No more Americans. I can very much see a scenario like that. I think, the funny thing too is that, I talk to my family, a lot of whom are not so pro-Trump, and I told them, I was like, look, the irony is that I think that you and me living in Israel are going to feel the effects of a Trump presidency far more directly, actually, than your average American, for whom, to pass domestic law in the United States, you're talking about, has to pass through both the House and the Senate in Congress, signed by the president, and then it's got to go through the courts. It's got to go through the court challenges. So it's basically caught up in a couple of years of rigmarole before it officially becomes policy and law and something that can actually be felt tangibly amongst the American people. In terms of foreign policy, the executive has all the authority. If Trump decides, okay, no more weapons to Israel, there's no court for the Israelis to appeal to. There's nothing in that. The foreign policy side is entirely up to the executive and entirely up to the president, and we're going to be feeling the effects of that immediately and have no recourse over whatever decision is made. And I think a Trump presidency is one that I could potentially see decoupling itself from the Israelis, especially at a time when, if we want to tie this a bit into Amsterdam, It's coming out especially at a time where, anti-Semitism, however you want to define it, because that word is so loaded to the point that I almost hate using it because now everything is anti-Semitism. But to the point where, Americans are asking the question of, or the very legitimate question of how much is AIPAC and Israeli money and politics truly involved in our own political decision making? And should we be allowing this foreign nation to have such a tight control over our own policies? To where I think if you had a president like Donald Trump, someone who is no longer concerned about donor money or reelection, to step in and say, okay, we're no longer going to be going out, we're no longer going to be towing the line with organizations like AIPAC and very pro-Israeli donor, large Jewish donor organizations, and we're going to start to do what feels like is better for the average American. I think he's going to get a lot of support. I think the average American will be very much in favor of something like that.
Or he can, that's possible, but he can also go down the other line of kind of removing America from the picture, not pressuring Israel to end the war or ending U.S. military aid to Israel. He can kind of say, it's not my business. I really don't care. Let the Israelis and the Arabs keep fighting each other the way they normally do. And he can kind of spin it in a way of like, whatever.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Not my business.
American decoupling from Israel. Exactly. Like, yeah, I don't. American decoupling is exactly, I think, as you just described.
But I think there's two types of decoupling. There's active decoupling and there's passive decoupling. Passive decoupling, which is what I just described, is more like, let the Israelis do what they want, Arabs do what they want.
We're washing our hands of this conflict.
We're going to wash our hands, but wash our hands in a way of like, we're not going to make active statements to the public as to what sort of diplomatic initiatives we're trying to do to bring the conflict to an end. I would say the more active approach is coupling all of what we're discussing now with ending U.S. military aid to Israel, very much working in an active and proactive manner to pressure Israel on both sides to bring the conflict to an end. I don't see that happening in a Trump administration, maybe more behind the scenes. I do think that passive decoupling is very, very likely, where Trump kind of just has, I'm not going to, end the delivery of 1-ton bombs to Israel the way that Biden temporarily did at certain points of his administration. I'm just, whatever, I'm not gonna make a fuss out about it. I don't want to get my hands dirty in this conflict. It kind of reminds me of this other news point that I didn't mention in the roundup, which is the possibility that Hamas will be removed from Qatar as its main base of operation, which Qatar has kind of, in its own way, is decoupling itself from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Qatar's over this shenanigans.
Right, where Qatar's kind of saying, we can't continue hosting Hamas in our territory, and, these reports that are coming out now are indicating that at a certain point Qatar will ask Hamas to leave its territory and to move its leadership elsewhere. It's kind of like that, where Qatar is, it's not like anti-Hamas. It's not going out and it's going to start, sanctioning Hamas or like going out to, fight Hamas in the international league. It's going to say, what you say in Hebrew, I don't have any.
You guys are more trouble than you're worth.
I have no energy for this anymore. Let them fight the Israelis on their own. I don't want to deal with this anymore.
Yeah, I can very much see that. To be honest, I mean, look, when I see a lot of the rhetoric coming from the America First crowd, I actually tend to see a much more aggressive stance in regards to Israel, saying, let's stop all funding, let's stop, any of this sort of America siding at all with anybody in this conflict, and let them sort it out themselves. And the argument being made is that, look, if Israel is in such a vulnerable position without the United States, they'll be forced to come to the table, and they'll be forced to come to a peace agreement. And there's a lot of people in the America First crowd that would make the argument that had America done this 30, 40 years ago, that there would already be peace in the Middle East, because Israel would have been forced to. That had no other objective. If at the end of the day, let's bring it back to, say, middle school, right? If your best friend in middle school is the biggest, baddest kid on the playground, and you know that whatever fight you get into, he's got your back, then you're less afraid to get into fights. But on the flip side, if that kid is not going to come and back you up, and you're on your own, then suddenly you have more of an incentive to not go picking fights and to handle things in a more diplomatic way. And I think that that's kind of the argument that a lot of the America First crowd is making, and they're saying it would be beneficial to us as well, because at the end of the day, it's less American treasure and American lives going for an ally, to an ally for whom peace is a seeming illusion, and for whom we don't anticipate any resolution coming to this conflict. On the flip side, I will say, Hamas has several Americans still being held hostage. Something that, where, if you look back at the history of American hostages in the Middle East, there was a time when if you had an American hostage, you could expect the U.S. Navy on your coastline ready to bombard you. And there is a potential point or a potential argument to be made that Donald Trump will take that very seriously. This idea of Americans being held hostage in Gaza, to the point where he will not only allow Israelis to take the gloves off, but even involve American troops themselves in a more active manner to bring the American hostages home, sort of as a show of force and as a reminder to the world that Americans are untouchable throughout the world. It's I think a less likely scenario, but not so far as a fantasy as what I would anticipate.
It's definitely possible. Like you said earlier, you never know what you're gonna get with the new old guy coming back to the White House.
Even after 4 years, no one really knows what to expect from this guy. So, we'll see. I made the joke with my cousin, because my cousin, he's a very pro-Trump Republican Long Island Jew, and he's like, "Don't worry, Dylan, we just got one more round at Miloim, and then Trump's gonna end the war." And I made the joke, and just a joke, by the way, in case this is taken out of context. Where if Trump ends the war, then I will gladly participate in the next October or January 6th. Just because I'm like, please let it be over already. I can't keep doing these circles. Everybody here is exhausted and the news is terrible. And let's just if he can end the war, then wow, he will be my favorite president in history.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
We'll see if he can end the war, or he can at least create a picture of ending something related to the war. That might be just enough for him.
There's definitely one person who appears to be very happy with Trump presidency, and that's Benjamin Netanyahu.
Who is that guy?
Yeah, right. Very low-profile guy, especially lately. But he was very much betting on a Trump presidency, and like what always seems to happen with BVs, he always comes out on top. And he got that, and on the day before the election, he fired Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant. Previously, he had tried this back in March of 2023, which led to mass protests, including a massive strike by the Izdarut, the Israeli labor organization, which shut down the entire country for an entire day and forced him to renege on that firing and allowed Gallant to stay in power. But this time, it appears to really have stuck. And Gallant, who has been serving as Minister of Defense now for the past 2 years and throughout the entire duration of this war, is no longer in power. Actually, Michael, I had a friend ask me a good question that I wasn't really able to answer, and hoping maybe you can answer for me instead, where they want to know what's the difference between the Minister of Defense versus the IDF Chief of Staff.
The Minister of Defense, in terms of power, you're saying, or
power, responsibility, yeah.
So it's, if you can compare it, I guess the Minister of Defense is parallel to the American Secretary of Defense, where the Minister of Defense is supposed to be the political representative that's responsible for the army, and other security services that are directly subordinate to him. And the Chief of Staff is basically the equivalent to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, directly responsible for the army. Someone who comes from within the army and as a general runs the army as a non-political figure. The biggest difference and important nuance between the Israeli Minister of Defense and the American Secretary of Defense is that, unlike in the United States, where the army is subordinate to the president and the Secretary of Defense is kind of like a political appointee that helps the U.S. president run the army and other security services, in Israel, the military is not subordinate to the prime minister. It's subordinate to the defense minister, which is a very, very important distinction to make. The defense minister is the ultimate supreme authority over the military, not the prime minister, not like the case in America where it's the president. and that gives him a certain degree of sway that is more common in parliamentary systems like Israel that doesn't exist in the United States. You can have situations, for example, how this whole nuance becomes important, where the Minister of Defense, if he doesn't agree with a certain military policy and he pushes back against the Prime Minister, he can basically get his way because he's ultimately the guy who's responsible for the military. It's not like the U.S. Secretary of Defense that, you know, he can give his opinion, but at the end of the day, has to listen to 100% of what the president tells him to do. The Minister of Defense is the ultimate authority responsible for the military. And, you know, taking this to the news point, Gallant's firing is definitely a very traumatic action that affects many Israelis. A lot of Israelis look at Gallant as being one of the few sane voices in power right now that has overseen, of course, the failure of October 7th, but after October 7th, what has largely been on several of the active war fronts a very, very successful Israeli counterattack, at least from the perspective of the Israeli public. So his firing is definitely very traumatic. We are on day 400 of the war, and many Israelis look at the situation in which Gallant has been removed from power as being a action carried out by an overzealous, highly political prime minister that is putting his own political concerns and his own political disagreements with the defense minister over the need to bring back the hostages, over the need to reinforce the lines of the IDF that is currently in need of more soldiers, despite the fact that many in Israel continue to refuse to show up to draft.
Speaking most about the Haredi community, I'm guessing.
Yeah, many Haredi men do not serve in the army. Most do not. Some do. And all this taken together, many Israelis are looking at the firing of Gallant as being a very traumatic happening that took place just on election day. That being said, to tie it into what you said earlier, this is the second time that we have gone through this. We have a bit of deja vu now where the prime minister fires the defense minister. And on time two, it seems that despite the trauma and the sadness, Israelis are not as angry as take one.
I don't even if it's that they're not as angry, or if they're just exhausted from the war and the effects of the war. And I mean, one thing I would like to add on to Gallant as well is that Gallant was very much trusted across the spectrum. He is in the Likud party, which is Netanyahu's party, but he was also willing to stand up to Netanyahu at a lot of crucial moments, which is something that you don't really see from a lot of Likud members. Likud is a very tightly organized political party to where the leader, Bibi, very much has supreme control over the people within that political party and within his own cabinet overall. Gallant was one of the few voices who, because he was also such a high-profile figure, would very often step up and push back in some cases against Netanyahu. For instance, most recently, where Gallant was saying that, okay, the IDF has done everything they can do in Gaza, we now need to move to a diplomatic solution to end this war already. Something that Bibi did not like hearing and likely influenced his decision to fire Gallant. But moving on from there, in terms of the second thing you mentioned, where Israelis aren't as angry this time around, I think that during the reform, the Israeli left of center, left wing parties had a bit more authority or a bit more influence on the Israeli public. And it seems like just lately during the course of this war, they do not. They've completely lost all of that, partly because of just, the October 7th attacks kind of throwing out the window any notion that the Gazans wanted to be peaceful partners and that Hamas wanted to be a government, and kind of throwing all that out the window. But also, I just think that the people who are currently at the center of Israeli society at this point, whose voices really are being heard and whose concerns are being taken seriously, are no longer the secular left so much, but more rather actually the religious Zionists. And excuse me, I have a personal theory as to why I think that's the case, and I think it's because Israeli society and Israeli government tends to be very responsive to the people they need most in their society. And at this point, the religious Zionists do appear to be doing most of the heavy lifting when it comes to this war. The vast majority of troops are made up of religious Zionists. Maybe not the vast majority, I would say, but most of the troops are made up of religious Zionists. Religious Zionists, by the way, just to be clear, these are religious Jews. They keep Shabbat, they keep kosher. The men tend to wear kippahs, the women tend to they cover their hair, but they still work. They're still active members of the Israeli economy, of Israeli society. They do their army service. And so they're not like the Haredi who completely live by Torah and who study Torah to the letter and live exactly by that. But they do believe very strongly and follow many of the larger guidelines of Judaism. And we can see that the effects of what's happening as these religious Zionists are continuously fighting and dying at a rate that appears to be much higher than other segments of Israeli society. I talk with a friend of mine who, she very much identifies as part of the religious Zionist community, and she, grew up in a neighborhood like that in a suburb near Haifa, and she said just on the block alone where she grew up, there are 4 people who have died on that block that she grew up with. This is something to where most Israelis at this point, or quite possibly everybody, knows somebody who has died in this war. But that is an extent that far surpasses the norm. And it is just one example, but it's an example that seems to reflect what I've been seeing and hearing in terms of the religious Zionist community. So to bring back to my larger point, when you have the secular left that a year ago went out and protested against Gallant, they were able to bring this momentum, these protests that actually stopped Bibi in his tracks. Whereas now, they're not the focus of the society. They're not the people who the government and Israeli society at large feel like they need the most. And as a result, their voices are largely ignored. Whereas we can see where there was a bill that was recently attempted to be passed in the Knesset, where the Haredi parties demanded that they continue to receive subsidies for daycare centers for the children of Haredis who are not serving in the army. And the religious Zionists came out in protests against that. And as a result, you had many Likudnik members, many members of the Likud, who came out and said they will not vote for that bill, that Bibi needs to keep his coalition together. I mean, that's how strong these people are, that they can cause the Likud to say to their own prime minister, we're not going to back you on this bill. And that's why I think, that's my personal theory, I think, why this time around, one of the main reasons this time around, that Gallant's firing was met with waves of silence.
Bibi is also firing Gallant now from a much stronger position than what he did last year, where not only is there a 7-front war taking place right now between Israel and its enemies, you also have a prime minister coming off after multiple successful assassinations of several terrorist organizations and other associated groups. You have many successful Israeli attacks in Lebanon and in other parts of the region, Iran, and other successful activity in the war in general. The prime minister is in a much stronger position now than ever before, and I think that, or at least in the past 2 years, and I think that this is giving him the credibility and the boost necessary to kind of fire Gallant and allow him to let this slide. I think that the irony of this whole situation is that this extra credibility that the prime minister has was largely due to Gallant to some great degree. Gallant was the defense official responsible for overseeing all of these major operations, outside of the operations of the Mossad and the Shin Bet, which are directly subordinate to the prime minister, but the other aspects of Israel's military activity in the region is directly a result of the defense minister's work. And Bibi, like he knows how to do perfectly well, took perfect advantage of these successes, pushed away the many failures that he had from October 7th forward, and leveraged this for his own political gain to fire Gallant do it on election day in the United States so that we'd pay
That
less
was going to be another
attention.
big point too, is that the American election very much overshadowed this firing as well.
Right. And move on from there. There definitely was some pushback on the initial day when this happened. And like I said, a lot of, especially among more center left Israelis and some right wing Israelis, definitely a feeling of trauma and of, wow, how are we going to continue from here? But the
Mostly upset about the principle of firing your defense minister in the middle of a war.
In the middle of a war. But you compare this to last time, we're already talking about the next thing. I look at the headlines on my phone of, what we're talking about. We've already have brand new headlines that have nothing to do with the Gallant firing.
Relative to March 23, it was very much met with a shrug versus the
right
outpouring of outrage as a result of the firing. What do you think this is going to mean in terms of the war, though? First of all, who is the next the next Minister of Defense going to be?
So the incoming Minister of Defense, or I shouldn't say incoming, the new Minister of Defense, who just finished his handover ceremony with the outgoing Minister of Defense and is now in power. His name is Israel Katz, a highly experienced politician and BB operator that's been in the system now for many years. His previous job was Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's also served as Minister of Transportation. Has been the minister of many ministries. Very well experienced politician, highly inexperienced when it comes to the defense establishment, which leaves many Israelis worried as to his credentials to take on this position. I'll say about Israel Katz that he is a particularly uninspiring politician. If you listen to him speak, he does not, as most politicians don't have, but him particularly, does not match the charisma of Netanyahu or any other leading politician in the Israeli political scene. He's kind of some compliment him for his bulldozer ability to come into a ministry and push his own agenda, and say that he knows how to tell the bureaucrats where their place is and to put them in their place. But by and large, he's a highly uninspiring, security-wise inexperienced politician. And we're going to have to see how he fits into this new role. I think from Bibi's perspective, it's a win-win. Either he'll do well in his job and the public will ultimately forgive him, quote-unquote, for this firing of Gallant, or Katz will do terrible in his job and Bibi will decide, basically use this to his advantages, basically kind of pitting all of the future failures of this war on his inexperienced new defense minister. So this could only be a win for Bibi, no matter which way it ends up going. I will say, as one closing thought on this specific question, that if you look at Bibi's history, Bibi does not tend to make a lot of friends in the political system outside of some stable coalition partners like the Haredim and a couple of other groups. But Bibi is well known for burning his relationships with many of his former political partners. He's particularly well known for doing this with his ministers of defense. If you look at Bibi's record with all of his ministers of defense, almost all of them have ended with a firing or some sort of public spat. He removed Moshe Ya'alon from office and replaced him with Avigdor Lieberman. Him and Lieberman got into a public spat, which ultimately led to the multiple rounds of elections that we saw not too many years ago. He had Ehud Barak as defense minister for many years, and that ultimately collapsed and fell apart, and that relationship was destroyed. He had a defense minister for years in the 90s that Bibi became very suspicious of from a political perspective and decided to end that political relationship in order to ensure that it wouldn't encroach on his position. So let's just say I wouldn't be surprised if this, must be, I don't know what number defense minister this is for Bibi. I don't know how much longer Israel Katz is going to continue in the political system after taking on this role.
That's very interesting too, especially as you say, and I think you're absolutely correct. Many Israelis are looking at this appointment with a lot of skepticism because of how you said Israel Katz is not very inspiring and he has no experience. So I think many Israelis are expecting him to fail, and when something inevitably does go wrong, defense-wise, Bibi has the perfect doormat to step on and say, this guy, he can't handle it. If only he'd listen to me more, kind of thing. But it's very interesting what you said. I didn't know that actually about Bibi. Why is he so antagonistic towards his defense ministers, do you think?
I think for him, the defense minister is typically one of the more popular political figures in Israel, no matter who the defense minister is. They typically have this aura of them of being the ultimate figure responsible for the army and the security system. And I think Bibi finds that very threatening. He does not like to have other figures taking that spotlight from him. And you have this rotating door when Bibi is the prime minister, the defense minister is going to, one guy's going to come in, another guy's going to come out. For any of our Harry Potter fans out there, the Minister of Defense is the Israeli equivalent to the professor, Defense Against the Dark Arts professor.
I was wondering
Where
where you're going with that.
literally every movie, you have a new professor in that position. It's the same thing in Israel. Once a year, we're gonna have a defense minister
great.
being replaced, new professor of the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Yeah. That's how Bibi is.
Amazing. Wow. Okay. That's super interesting. And yeah, I think it actually sheds a lot of interesting light about why now someone like Israel Katz would be the perfect minister of defense for somebody like Netanyahu. Somebody who's entirely, seems like more of a yes man to Bibi, entirely reliant upon him, and is the perfect fall guy for when something goes wrong.
When something goes wrong.
Speaking of things going wrong, the other big headline recently that a lot of people were talking about is Amsterdam. And I guess just Mikey kind of mentioned at the beginning, but just for a quick background, there was a soccer game in Amsterdam between Maccabi Tel Aviv and another team called Ajax. What country were they from?
Well,
Italy?
I know nothing about.
Yeah, I know the wrong guy. We'll have to do a soccer podcast to check in. But another team, foreign European team, and they were playing in Amsterdam. A lot of Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. It's a very big team in Israel, so they had a lot of fans going out there to support their team. And the long story short version is that they were jumped by large groups of pro-Palestinian, largely Arab citizens of the Netherlands. Much of it was caught on film, which for Israelis was very reminiscent of October 7th. I mean, you saw a lot of Israelis lying limp on the streets, getting kicked and punched. People who were, getting robbed, and it was very much filmed. Images of people then running into hotel rooms or accosting people on the street. What's your, show us your identity, show us this. Very much reminiscent of European pogrom. It has, was seen in the years leading up to World War II and for decades prior. The longer version, the more controversial version, is that a lot of these guys, the Israelis, who prior to this whole event taking place, were not exactly being the best guests of a foreign country. Many of them were ripping down Israeli or Palestinian flags, doing chants like the IDF is going to F the people of Gaza. The kind of thing that would very much rile up particularly someone who identifies, who either themselves are Arab and would identify with the Gazans, or who just is more inclined to identify with Gazans, whose social media feed is filled with images of dead Palestinian children as a result of Israeli bombs, and who probably don't need a lot of provocation to go beating up a bunch of Israelis walking around acting like soccer hooligans. The example I gave to my wife, because she was very up in arms about it, understandably so. The example I gave was, well, imagine that Israel was hosting a soccer game and there were some, let's just say there were some Egyptian Arabs that were out here and we're doing some kind of chant like, oh, October 7th, every year. October 7th is the best thing ever. Would anybody in Israel really be surprised if they then got a huge public beatdown from an angry mob of Israelis? Probably not.
Yeah.
I think if you go into any foreign country and you intentionally antagonize the native population, you can expect people to act the way people do, which can be quite violent at times. Again, this is not me condoning the violence, or this is not me saying these guys deserve what happened to them. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that that when you're in a foreign country and you're a guest of that country, it behooves you to act to act as a representative of your country and to behave diplomatically. And that at the end of the day, for me, what it kind of represented was just how much of a bubble Israelis live in. I don't think, because Israeli media is not like U.S. media. It is subject to military censors. It is subject to government censor. There is no freedom of press in Israel like there is in the United States. Israelis see kind of the narrative that the military and the government want them to see, whereas the rest of the world is experiencing this war very differently from the rest of Israelis, and they see images and hear stories. Sometimes stories actually from IDF veterans talking about the horrible things they did, which you will not see in the Israeli press, but you will see even in mainstream media outlets like CNN. And as a result, people outside of Israel experience this war very differently than how we do, and their emotional reaction to it is very different.
Yeah.
And a lot of Israelis they act shocked, like, oh, they don't understand how people can think this way of Israelis, whereas the sad reality is that Israelis themselves are often blind and deaf to the reality of their own war that they themselves are carrying out.
I can understand what you're saying from the perspective of, we're definitely not, I don't think any side is 100% innocent, and we're definitely not 100% innocent. And of course, if we had soccer fans that were speaking in a way that they shouldn't be speaking, then that should be condemned. And obviously, we know how words can easily spin into violence just by taking it one step further. And there's a certain degree to which I agree with you. I don't know if I would say that about the freedom of press. I don't know if I would say that Israel doesn't have freedom of press and only goes to the military line. Yeah, like Israel does have a largely free press with a military censor that does come in for sensitive or other matters that can't be published to the public. But you are by and large right that the media does hold the Israeli narrative of the war, maybe not because of military pressure, but because of just what the Israeli public expects their media to sell to them on mainstream media channels. So there is a certain degree to which I can understand you're saying, but look, like you said yourself, even with all that aside, there's nothing that could justify or logically explain the horrible violence that we see recorded on what happened in Amsterdam. I mean, we're seeing videos now of Jewish Israeli soccer fans being walked up to in Amsterdam by angry mobs, asking them, where are you from, what's your name, and beating them up and kicking them on the street. I mean, this is just unacceptable behavior, which we also didn't, important to keep in mind, this parallel behavior we did not see from the Israelis. That we have Israelis walking around Amsterdam and looking to find Arabs to go beat up and to go fight against. Yeah. So obviously we're not perfect. We definitely have our faults to us, but at the end of the day, this at its core, what we saw in Amsterdam can't be spun any other way but a pogrom. That's what it was.
I think I think you're right in many respects. Look, I think at the end of the day, had it been, these guys were saying these chants and tearing down Palestinian flags and they got beat up kind of right then and there in the street, I would have condemned the violence, but there would have been a part of me that's like, okay, well, you guys were being provocative, and when you roll those dice and take that risk of being provocative, sometimes there are consequences for those actions. What then happened afterwards, though, this mass mob violence that then spiraled into searching hotel rooms and questioning people on the street, and very much turned into what was largely described in social media by the perpetrators themselves as a Jew hunt. Yes, that very much carries a lot of the themes and the memories and the horrifying images of a pogrom. Thankfully, this one did not end the same way that Kristallnacht did. This everybody is alive. There were several hospitalizations, but everybody is alive and okay and accounted for and back in Israel. But it could have very quickly, the damage could have been much worse.
And I think we're going to learn a lot more about what led up to this incident and caused it in the coming days. Initial reports are starting to come out now that the Mossad was already aware of some sort of flare-up on social media in the immediate hours leading up to the event that led the Mossad to warn Dutch authorities to beef up security at the event, warnings that were largely ignored and not given a response by the Dutch. Whether or not these reports are accurate or not, that remains to be seen. I'm sure as the days as we go through the coming days, we're gonna be getting a whole round of fresh reports coming out of Israel and other countries regarding what we knew, what we didn't know, how much of this was planned, how much of this wasn't, and of course the answer to the question of whether or not this pogrom in Amsterdam was organized and planned, or if it was truly a spontaneous act carried out by a bunch of anti-Semitic bystanders near the game. We'll have to see.
Yeah, I guess once the kind of fog lifts a little bit and more information comes out and things become clear, we can make a stronger assessment. That'll have to wait for our next episode, which will hopefully be out in a couple weeks. I will be returning to reserve duty on Sunday, hopefully for just another week and a half or so. It's unclear exactly how much time will be spent. But after that, I'm sure me and Mike will find an excuse to meet and have a few drinks and record another podcast episode, as we must, as news rolls fast here, particularly when one of us is not available, such as when you were gone and there was the pager attack in Nasrallah and all this stuff happening, and then I was gone and Lebanon, and so whenever we're not together, something big always
Something
happens.
big happens, yeah.
So we'll hopefully be able to speak about the aftermath of that and as quickly as possible. But yes, other than that, that's it. Final thoughts?
None on my end. Just want to wish you easy retransition back into the rest of your reserve duty.
Thank you.
And hopefully, as you said, this will be the end for now of this round of reserve duty, and you'll have an easy time there, and you'll come back on the date that was planned with renewed energy, and we'll be able to continue from there.
No surprises from Yisrael Katz or anybody else, hopefully. That's the prayer. We'll see. Knock on wood.
Knock on wood. Knock on wood.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. Take care. Stay safe. We'll speak to y'all soon.